At my grandfather's will reading, my family inherited his yacht, penthouse, luxury cars, and company. For me, the lawyer handed just a small envelope with a plain ticket to Monaco. Guess your grandfather didn't love you that much, my mother laughed. Hurt but curious, I decided to go. When I arrived, a driver held up a sign with my name. "Ma'am, the prince wants to see you." My name is Emily Rhodes and I'm 27 years old. I sat in a ridiculously ornate chair in a lawyer's office downtown, the air thick with the smell of old paper, lemon polish, and a particular kind of greed that feels almost metallic on the tongue. My family was arranged around the polished mahogany table like vultures waiting for a feast. They were experts at performing grief, and today's performance was in full swing. Dad, whose name is Hugh Rhodes, was trying to look somber, but he couldn't stop the nervous tap of his expensive shoe against the table leg or the frequent furtive glances at his watch. Mom, Valerie, was dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. Across from me, Derek, my brother, was scrolling through his phone under the table, the faint glow illuminating a smug grin. He was probably looking at sports cars or apartments he couldn't quite afford until today. And next to him, my cousin, Kendra Whitaker, was practicing her grieving but graceful expression in the reflection of a silver water pitcher, adjusting the tilt of her head to find the most flattering angle of sorrow. The lawyer, a man with a face like a dried apple, began to read from the will. His voice was a low drone, a monotonous river of legal language that carried my grandfather's empire away in pieces. The assets started flowing, and the performance of grief quickly gave way to quiet, triumphant nods. Mom got the Napa estate, $24 million of sun-drenched vineyards and Tuscan-style architecture. She squeezed Dad's arm, a perfect picture of marital support, but her eyes were already decorating the master suite. Dad inherited Rhodes Shipping, the company my grandfather Graham Whitaker built from two rusty freighters into a $32 million regional powerhouse. He nodded slowly, a king accepting his rightful crown. Derek got the Manhattan penthouse and a collection of vintage cars, $8.5 million worth of bachelor pad bragging rights. A smirk he couldn't contain played on his lips. Kendra received the yacht and the Martha's Vineyard house, a neat $6.5 million. She let out a small, performative gasp as if the sheer generosity was too much to bear. The lawyer cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. And for Emily Rhodes, the whole family turned to look at me. Their expressions were a carefully blended cocktail of pity and impatience. "Get this last little detail over with so we can go sign the real papers." I was the good granddaughter, the one who actually spent time with Grandpa Graham, especially in his last few years. I was the one who read him the Wall Street Journal when his eyes got bad, the one who listened for hours to his stories about building his empire from nothing, about the deals he'd made, the gambles he'd won. He'd given me an old, heavy brass compass once, years ago. "It always points true north, Emily," he'd said, his voice raspy but firm. "So should you." It was in my pocket right now, its weight a small, solid comfort against my leg. I instinctively touched it. The lawyer slid a simple, plain white envelope across the acres of polished wood. It stopped in front of me, that was it. Derek didn't even bother to hide his snort of laughter. "Probably a gift card to a bookstore," he whispered to Kendra, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Kendra, in turn, gave me a look of practiced sympathy. "Don't spend it all in one place, Em." Their mockery was a familiar sting, a dull ache I'd learned to live with. But my mom's look was the worst. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even disappointment. It was a quiet, profound satisfaction, as if the universe had just confirmed a truth she'd always held, that I was the small one, the afterthought. As if this was exactly as it should be, the familiar heat of shame rose in my cheeks, a hot tide I fought to control. I kept my expression perfectly blank, my hands steady in my lap. It was a skill I'd perfected over 27 years of being their daughter, their sister, their niece. I didn't open it in front of them. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing my disappointment or whatever it was they expected to see. I stood up, the legs of the heavy chair scraping against the floor. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I took the plain white envelope, my name written on the front in my grandfather's familiar, elegant script, and walked out of the office without a backward glance. Their collective sigh of relief was almost audible. The last piece of business was concluded. In the sterile, echoing quiet of the building's marble lobby, I leaned against a cool wall and tore the envelope open. My hands were shaking just a little. Inside wasn't a gift card. The first thing I saw was a ticket, thick and glossy, a first-class one-way ticket to Monaco. Beneath it was a single sheet of heavy cream-colored paper folded in half. I unfolded it. It was a note from my grandfather. His handwriting was as strong and clear as I remembered it. "Your 27th birthday is next week," it read. "Time to claim what's yours. Go to this address. They are expecting you." He always did have a flair for the dramatic, but it was the final item in the envelope that made my heart stop. It was a bank statement, a simple, computer-printed statement for a trust account. The account was held in my name, the Emily Rhodes Trust. I scanned the page, my eyes searching for the bottom line, the final number. When I found it, I had to read it 3 times, certain it was a typo, a misplaced decimal point. But it wasn't. The balance was $352 million. I stared at the number, the digits blurring together. I could feel the rhythmic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. I looked back at my grandfather's note, then at the first-class ticket. A plan. This was a plan. He knew they'd act like this. He knew they would dismiss me, mock me, and celebrate their own good fortune without a second thought for the man who had given it to them. He had planned this entire moment, this quiet exit, this solitary revelation in an empty lobby. I clutched the ticket in my hand, its crisp edges digging into my palm. This wasn't an inheritance, it was an assignment. And I was about to find out what it was. The flight was a blur of things I'd only ever seen in movies. Champagne appeared before I even thought to ask for it. The flight attendants called me Miss Rhodes and offered me hot towels and menus with fancy French words. I felt like an imposter in a costume, a science teacher from Portland who'd somehow slipped past security into a world of leather seats that folded into beds. I spent most of the 10-hour flight staring out the window, watching the clouds drift by, the bank statement tucked securely in my bag, its presence a heavy, unbelievable weight. Monaco was another world entirely. Stepping out of the airport, the air itself felt different. It was warm and smelled of salt and money and blooming flowers. Everything seemed to gleam, from the polished black cars to the sunglasses on the impossibly chic people striding past. A quiet, impeccably dressed driver was waiting for me just outside customs, holding a simple sign with my name on it. He didn't ask questions, just took my single suitcase and led me to a silent, luxurious sedan. The address my grandfather had given me wasn't a bank, and it wasn't a law office. The driver took me up winding roads, the brilliant blue of the Mediterranean Sea stretching out below us. He pulled up to a discreet, elegant building that looked more like a private villa than a place of business, its white walls draped in bougainvillea, overlooking the sparkling harbor. I was led through polished marble halls filled with modern art and the quiet hum of a sophisticated security system. I finally came to a sunlit office with a wall of glass that looked out over the sea. A man stood to greet me, his smile kind but formal. He was tall and elegant, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that made him look both powerful and approachable. "Miss Rhodes," he said, extending a hand. His English was perfect, with only a trace of an accent. "I am Adrian Marlowe. Your grandfather was a dear friend." I shook his hand, my own feeling small and ordinary in his. He gestured to the stunning view. "Welcome to my home. And to the headquarters of your trust." I must have looked confused because he gave a small, understanding smile. I recognized him then from a society magazine my mother had left out on the coffee table once. He wasn't just a friend of my grandfather, he was Prince Adrian, a member of the royal family. Prince Adrian explained everything with a calm, matter-of-fact tone, as if he were discussing the weather instead of turning my entire world upside down. He poured 2 glasses of water and sat across from me at a small table, the bright Monaco sun streaming in. The trust wasn't just the $352 million on that statement. That was just one of the cash accounts. The real inheritance was a portfolio, an empire in miniature that my grandfather had been building for me in secret for over a decade. It owned controlling stakes in 2 massive resort casinos. The first was the Azure Promenade right here in Monaco, a glittering palace of a place I could see from the window. The second was the Aurelius Grand in Las Vegas, one of the biggest and most profitable operations on the Strip. He mentioned their annual profits casually as if they were trivial amounts. The one here in Monaco netted about $41 million a year. The one in Vegas generated about $152 million. The numbers were so large they sounded fake, like something from a board game. On top of that, the trust held major commercial buildings in London, Tokyo, and Sydney. The total value of the portfolio wasn't $352 million. It was approximately $1.23 billion. I think I stopped breathing. My grandfather, he explained, had been sending me a $62,000 yearly stipend, channeled through a scholarship fund I thought was an academic grant I'd been lucky enough to keep receiving after college. It was enough for me to live a comfortable, normal life, to pay my rent, drive a reliable car, and not worry about bills. He wanted me to grow up grounded. He wanted me to become a person, not a product of wealth. He'd seen what it had done to the rest of the family, and he was determined to protect me from that poison. The trust had been set up with strict instructions, complete privacy, and no access until my 27th birthday. Prince Adrian stood and walked over to a large, ornate safe concealed behind a painting on the wall. He spun a dial, the clicks echoing softly in the quiet room, and opened the heavy door. He retrieved a single sealed envelope. It was cream-colored, just like the one I'd received at the will reading. "Graham asked me to give this to you when you arrived," he said, handing it to me. "He wanted you to read it here." It was another letter from my grandfather. His handwriting was shakier this time, the ink a little faded, as if he'd written it some time ago. He wrote about his fears about watching my parents and my brother become consumed by the wealth he had created. He said they loved the things that money could buy, but they had forgotten the value of the work it took to earn it. He wrote that he saw something different in me, a steadiness, a quiet strength. He mentioned the compass again. "You have a compass pointing true north, Emily. Don't ever let them break it." Reading those words felt like he was in the room with me, his hand on my shoulder. Then I turned the page, and the words that came next shattered me. He wrote about a conversation he'd had with my mom years ago when I was just finishing college. He had been considering bringing me into the family business, starting me on the ground floor at the shipping company, teaching me the ropes himself. He'd told her his plan, and my mom, my own mother, had talked him out of it. Her words, which my grandfather had written down verbatim, were burned into the page. "Keep Emily small," she had told him. "It's for the best. She's not like the rest of us, she's more manageable this way." Manageable, compliant, useful. She hadn't been protecting me, she'd been hobbling me. She wanted a daughter who wouldn't be a competitor, a daughter who would stay in her place, quiet and unassuming. My grandfather's response wasn't to argue with her. It was to go to Monaco and secretly hide the crown jewels of his empire in my name, leaving the rest of them to fight over the scraps they thought were the entire feast. I stood on the balcony of the prince's office, my hands gripping the cool stone railing. The endless blue of the Mediterranean stretched out before me, a picture of perfect tranquility that was the exact opposite of the storm raging inside me. The hurt was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Manageable, the word echoed in my mind over and over. All those years I thought I was just the quiet one, the dependable one, the daughter who never asked for anything. I thought it was my personality, but it wasn't. It was a cage they had carefully built for me, and I had never even seen the bars. My grandfather hadn't just given me money, he had given me the truth. He had given me a weapon. And he had given me a choice. For a moment, all I felt was the raw pain of that betrayal. My own mother, But as the minutes ticked by, watching the multi-million-dollar yachts glide across the harbor, the shock and the hurt began to fade. They were replaced by something else. A quiet, cold resolve that settled deep in my bones. I thought of them back in Portland, celebrating their inheritances. Dad puffed up with pride over his new company. Mom planning renovations for her Napa estate. Derek probably already driving one of his new cars. They thought they had won. They had no idea the game had just started. I turned back from the balcony and walked back into the office, my steps sure and steady. I looked at Prince Adrian, whose kind eyes were watching me with an expression of deep understanding. "There's a shipping company in my father's portfolio," I said, my voice clear and even. "Rhodes Shipping. I need to know everything about its financial health. Right now." Prince Adrian, true to his word, connected me with a team of financial analysts in Geneva. I never saw their faces or learned their names. They were just calm, professional voices on a secure conference line, their expertise a formidable tool now at my disposal. They worked with astonishing speed. Within 24 hours, I had a complete, brutally honest picture of Rhodes Shipping. It arrived as a heavily encrypted file in my inbox. On paper, the company was profitable, a fact my dad loved to boast about at every family dinner and holiday gathering. He'd talk about quarterly growth and market share until everyone's eyes glazed over. But the reality laid bare in the stark numbers of the report was a house of cards. The company was cash-starved. It was bleeding money on interest payments. Dad had taken out a series of risky, high-interest loans to expand too quickly, buying bigger ships to try and compete with the international giants. He'd been chasing prestige, not stability. The core problem, the ticking time bomb, was what the analysts called a balloon payment. It was a massive final payment on one of the biggest loans due in less than 90 days. There was no way the company had the liquid cash to cover it. The analysts were certain of it. My father had been gambling, hoping for a miracle quarter to save him. Failure to make that payment would mean defaulting on the loan, and the bank would take control of everything. The analyst's report included something I didn't expect: a full employee roster, 214 names. I scrolled through the list, seeing not just names but job titles. Dockworkers, mechanics, welders, administrative staff, ship captains. These were people with families, with mortgages to pay and kids to feed. They weren't abstract figures on a balance sheet. The report outlined the most likely scenario if the company defaulted: massive, immediate layoffs. The bank wouldn't care about the people. They would chop up the company and sell it for parts, ships, equipment, contracts to get their money back as quickly as possible. The employees would be the first to go. My dad would see them as an unfortunate but necessary casualty of business. He'd sit in his newly inherited Napa estate, swirl a glass of expensive wine, and talk about tough decisions and market realities. He'd find a way to frame it as someone else's fault. I remembered going to the docks with Grandpa Graham when I was a kid. The air smelled of salt and diesel and the noise was deafening, but Grandpa moved through it all with a calm authority. He knew the workers by name. He'd ask a welder about his daughter's soccer tournament or a crane operator about his upcoming fishing trip. He used to say, "A company isn't the ships or the buildings, Emily, it's the people. You take care of the people and they'll take care of the business." Looking at that list of 214 names, I knew this wasn't just about my family anymore, it was about them. I flew back to the United States, but I didn't go home to Portland. My flight from Monaco landed in New York. Prince Adrian had given me a name and a number before I left. A lawyer, a woman named Anya Sharma, who specialized in discreet corporate acquisitions. Her office was a sleek, minimalist space in a midtown skyscraper that looked down on the city. Anya, her name now attached to a real person, was sharp and energetic, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through you. She was completely unimpressed by the scale of my trust, which I found immensely reassuring. She treated it like a straightforward business problem to be solved. I laid out the whole situation for her: the company, the crippling debt, the looming 90-day deadline, and the complicated family dynamics. She listened patiently, taking notes on a tablet, asking a pointed question every now and then. "So you want to save it?" she asked finally, her pen hovering over the screen. "You want to bail out your father?" "No," I clarified, my voice firm. "I want to buy it anonymously." A slow smile spread across Anya's face. She got it immediately. "That's what a shell corporation is for," she said, her energy shifting from analytical to creative. "We'll create a new legal entity for you. It will have a bland, corporate name. It will be registered in a way that makes it impossible to trace back to you. It will be a ghost." We spent an hour brainstorming names. I wanted something that sounded solid, impersonal, and slightly boring, the kind of name that wouldn't attract any attention. I settled on Blue Meridian Holdings. It sounded respectable and utterly forgettable. The plan was brutally simple. Blue Meridian Holdings would make an unsolicited, all-cash offer to buy Rhodes Shipping. Anya explained the strategy to me. It wasn't enough to just make an offer, it had to be a perfectly crafted trap. First, the price had to be generous enough to be immediately tempting, to make my father feel like he was winning the lottery. We did the math. The company was technically valued at about $32 million, but it was carrying so much bad debt. We settled on an offer of $46.5 million. It was roughly 35% more than the company's book value. More importantly, it was more than enough to cover all the outstanding loans and still leave my dad with a hefty, multi-million-dollar profit. He'd be able to walk away looking like a genius who just pulled off the sale of a lifetime. The second and most important part was the deadline. "We'll give him 72 hours to accept the offer," Anya said, her eyes gleaming with tactical delight. "It's an aggressive move. It creates immense pressure. It limits his ability to shop around for other offers or get a second opinion. He'll be forced to make a decision based on the dazzling number in front of him and the ticking clock." It was a predator's move. Cold, calculated, and designed to exploit an opponent's weaknesses, in this case my father's greed and his pride. I would be using his own language, the language of money and power, against him. For a second, I felt a flicker of something uncomfortable, a pang of doubt. Was this who I was now, a corporate raider plotting against her own father? Then I remembered my mother's words, seared into my brain from my grandfather's letter. "Keep Emily small." The discomfort vanished, replaced by a cold, clear focus. This wasn't about being cruel, it was about being effective. Anya's team in New York drafted the official offer. It was a masterpiece of intimidating but straightforward legal language. It was printed on heavy, expensive-looking letterhead for the newly created Blue Meridian Holdings and delivered via a bonded courier to my dad's office at Rhodes Shipping. I was back in Portland by then, but I wasn't staying in my small teacher's apartment. That life felt like it belonged to someone else now. I checked into a luxury hotel downtown under a different name, needing the anonymity and the sterile quiet of the room to think. It didn't take long. My phone rang just after noon. The caller ID said Mom. I took a deep breath and answered, pitching my voice to sound exactly as it always did. Her voice was a flurry of high-pitched excitement and stress. "Emily, you won't believe what's happened. Some big investment firm from out of state just made an offer to buy the company. He's ecstatic." I played my part, the one I'd been rehearsing my whole life. "Wow, that's great news, Mom. I'm so happy for him." "It's a huge amount of money," she went on, practically breathless. "More than we ever thought possible, but they've given him this ridiculous deadline, 3 days. Can you even imagine the nerve?" Oh, I could imagine it perfectly. I had designed it. She then invited me to a family dinner that night. "To celebrate," she chirped. "Your father will want to tell you and Derek all about it." The invitation was what it always was. An afterthought, the dutiful daughter summoned to be an audience for their success, but this time it was an opportunity. "Of course," I said, "I'll be there." Dinner was at their house, the big colonial I grew up in. It felt smaller now, the high ceilings and grand rooms somehow less impressive. My dad was holding court at the head of the dining table, expansive and proud, a conquering hero returned from battle. He swirled the wine in his glass, beaming at his small audience. Blue Meridian Holdings, he said, savoring the name as if it were a vintage Bordeaux. Never heard of them, but they're sharp. A bit aggressive for my taste, putting a clock on me like that, but they certainly know value when they see it. Derek was already on his phone, looking up what kind of car he could buy with his share of the eventual payout. Mom was talking about bringing in a designer from San Francisco to completely redo the Napa house. They were so high on the fantasy of the money, so caught up in what it meant for them, that they weren't thinking clearly. They were celebrating a victory against an enemy they didn't even know existed. I let them talk for a while, just listening, pushing a piece of salmon around my plate. Then, when there was a brief lull in the conversation, I picked my moment. "So if you sell," I asked, my voice calm and even, "what happens to the employees?" The question hung in the air, a sudden dissonant note in their symphony of greed. My dad waved a dismissive hand, annoyed at the interruption. "Oh, that's just business, Emily. The new owners will handle all of that, not my problem anymore," I pressed, keeping my tone gentle, curious. "But a big company like that, an investment firm, they'll probably look for efficiencies, won't they, to make their money back on the investment? That usually means layoffs, doesn't it?" Derek scoffed from across the table. "Don't be so naive, sis. That's how the world works. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs." He said it with such casual cruelty, as if the lives of 200 people were nothing more than eggshells to be discarded. "I'm just curious," I said, ignoring him and keeping my eyes locked on my dad. "What kind of transition plan did they propose in the offer? Did they say anything about employee retention or severance packages?" My dad faltered. His confident, booming posture sagged just a little. Of course he hadn't asked. The thought hadn't even occurred to him. He'd been so blinded by the huge number on the offer sheet that he hadn't considered the consequences for anyone but himself. I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a tiny crack in his proud facade. I wasn't accusing him of anything, I was just asking questions, the kind of responsible questions a good daughter might ask, but I was introducing risk. I was framing the perfect offer not just as a windfall, but as a potential headache, a moral problem he might have to answer for later. He was being squeezed by Anya's 72-hour deadline on one side, and now, by the quiet, uncomfortable questions from his manageable daughter on the other. For the first time in my life, I saw him look at me and not know what to think. The next 48 hours were a tense waiting game. I stayed in my hotel room, getting intermittent updates from Anya. My dad had his lawyers scrambling to review the offer. They confirmed what he already knew: it was a strong offer, well above market value for a company in its precarious position. They also warned him that the tight deadline was a classic high-pressure tactic, but that didn't change the numbers. He was trapped. On one side was the looming balloon payment he knew he couldn't afford, a cliff edge he was about to be pushed over. On the other was this perfect, clean exit, a golden parachute that would let him float away from his own bad decisions smelling like a rose. My questions at dinner had planted a small seed of doubt, making him think about the narrative about how things might look. But in the end, greed was a more powerful force than guilt. On the final day, with just hours to spare on the deadline, he signed the papers. The deal was done. Anya called me the moment the signed documents were scanned and sent back to her. "It's official," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "Blue Meridian Holdings is now the sole owner of Rhodes Shipping." I thanked her and hung up the phone. I stood at the window of my hotel room looking out over the city of Portland. I felt quiet. There was no surge of elation, no triumphant cheer, just the calm, steady certainty of a compass needle finding north. The first piece was in place. That night, my brother posted a photo on his social media account. A ridiculously expensive bottle of champagne with 2 glasses. The caption read, "To the next chapter, thanks for the payout, Dad." He had no idea who he was really thanking. The money was transferred from one of my accounts to theirs. The company was officially mine. The feeling was completely surreal. Just a few weeks ago, my biggest financial decision was whether to splurge on the expensive coffee beans at the grocery store. Now, I owned a shipping company, 2 casinos, and a portfolio of international real estate. I was no longer Emily Rhodes, high school science teacher. I was someone else, a person I was still getting to know. It felt like putting on a heavy winter coat that was several sizes too big. I wasn't used to the weight of it yet, but it was strangely grounding. My family believed they were finally free, unburdened by the legacy and responsibility of the family business. They were out celebrating a massive payout that I, from my anonymous hotel room, had signed off on. The irreversible choice had been made. There was no going back to being small Emily, the manageable daughter. That person was gone, and I realized with a startling clarity that I didn't miss her at all. The personal cost was clear. The last shred of hope for a normal, loving family had been severed. My grandfather had tried to protect me from them, but in the end, I had to be the one to make the final cut. I was truly on my own now. I spent the next week holed up with the financial reports from all my assets. Spreadsheets and profit and loss statements that covered entire tables. My grandfather's journal was always on the desk next to me. I kept turning back to one line I had bookmarked, a note he'd scrawled in the margin: "Wealth is a tool. You can use it to build, or you can use it as a sledgehammer." My family had always seen wealth as a sledgehammer, a way to get what they wanted, to display their status, to feel important and powerful. They used it to knock down anyone who got in their way. I looked at the vast numbers on the pages in front of me and saw something different. I saw the trust not as a pile of money, but as a source of influence, a lever long enough to move the world, or at least my small corner of it. The real power wasn't in having $1 billion in a bank account. It was in being able to save 214 jobs without breaking a sweat. It was in being able to take the company my father was running into the ground and turn it into something stronger, better, and more sustainable. My goal was no longer just about getting back at them. That felt too small now, too petty. The goal became clearer, sharper in my mind. I would build a legacy my grandfather would be proud of. And I would force my family to watch me do it from the sidelines. My first move as the new owner was made through another layer of anonymity. Anya set up a corporate management firm for me, a public-facing entity that would officially direct the actions of the mysterious Blue Meridian Holdings. We called it Northlight Management, a nod to my grandfather's compass. Our first official act was to send a letter to every single employee of Rhodes Shipping. The letter, printed on crisp Northlight letterhead, announced that the acquisition was complete. It guaranteed, in no uncertain terms, that all jobs, salaries, and benefits were secure. There would be no layoffs. Then came the second part. It announced a new, immediate investment of $12.5 million for cleaner fuel upgrades for the existing fleet. And it committed to the purchase of 3 new, state-of-the-art hybrid-powered vessels over the next 2 years. This wasn't just about saving the company from my father's mismanagement. It was about making it a leader in the industry. It was about building, it was about pointing the company and myself true north. I flew to Las Vegas on a weekday, booked a standard room under my own name, and tried not to feel ridiculous. It was strange watching the parade of people come and go from the casino, their faces lit by slot machines, the air thick with the smell of cheap perfume and fried food. I walked the floor like a student at a new school, taking notes in my head. I ate at the buffet where the chefs carved meats until my jaw ached. I watched the cocktail servers glide past in practice steps. I listened to the clink of chips and the low, constant hum of people hoping for a lucky break. The Aurelius Grand was humming along like a living thing. I spent long hours walking in circles, not because I was lost, but because I wanted to see everything up close. I watched the cleaning crew fold towels with unhurried care. I watched security move in silent knots through the crowd. The hum of machines and the chatter of tourists became a kind of white noise I found useful. Grandpa's voice kept coming back to me: "You learn more from the cleaning crew than you do from the board of directors." It was the kind of line that sounded sentimental until you realized how true it was. The people who actually make a place work notice the things executives miss. On my second morning, I asked to meet the general manager. The desk clerk blinked at my request and gave a name, Sabrina Cho. She had a crisp professional tone on the phone when I called, direct and polite. We agreed to meet after her morning rounds. When I stepped into her office later that day, it smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee. Her office was all business, framed certifications, neat stacks of reports, a whiteboard with color-coded notes. She stood up to shake my hand, eyes sharp and slightly tired. She wasn't small. She'd carried the place in her posture and in the way she talked about staffing and morale. We didn't get into formalities. I told her I was a representative from the new ownership group visiting to learn how things worked on the ground. She nodded, wary but professional. I started with the obvious. What's your biggest challenge right now? What keeps you up at night? She hesitated, then began to talk. She spoke about staffing issues, supply chain delays, the endless dance of promotions and temp hires. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that the casino's profits had dipped over the last 18 months in ways she couldn't explain. Occupancy was steady. Garbage trucks, security shifts, food sales, everything looked fine on the surface. But the margins were shrinking. Her voice tightened when she said the words soft. The numbers feel soft, she said. They leak and I haven't been able to find the hole. I didn't leap at her immediately. I let her talk. I mentioned something Grandpa had once said about vendors and linen bills, not accusing, just a small detail to see how she'd respond. Her eyes changed then, that tiny spark that tells you someone has been waiting for someone to notice. She told me about a procurement manager named Mark who'd been defensive in budget meetings. He'd been with the company a long time, older than most. People often trusted his instincts because he'd been around through a dozen managers and owners. But lately he bristled when anyone suggested a change. He's the kind of long-term employee who becomes part of the furniture, Sabrina said. She rubbed her temple. If I bring up concerns, everyone says I'm being ungrateful. But the money says something's wrong. I asked for the invoices from the top vendors over the last 2 years. Sabrina blinked at me. That's a lot of paperwork, she said. I smiled a little. Then start with the big ones. Food and beverage, linen service, security and beverages, spread them out. I have time. She hesitated, then placed a stack of printouts on her conference table. We pushed aside menus and promotional brochures and began to look. I wasn't an accountant, but I was trained to see patterns. Data and experiments in a science classroom teach you to notice the odd things. Numbers have a rhythm. Most of these danced together in ways that made sense. One set of invoices didn't fit the pattern. The food and beverage suppliers' bills had crept up steadily. Their unit prices rose, but the menus hadn't changed. Portions were the same. The number of events was steady, yet the bills were consistently 30% higher than the previous year. Each invoice was approved by Mark. There were handwritten initials on the approval lines, small and quick. It was sloppy work, the kind of thing that would get missed if you were used to trusting someone. I asked Sabrina to pull Mark's personnel file and his recent expense disclosures. She looked at me like she wasn't sure she should. I don't want to create a problem I can't fix, she said. I told her, you won't, we just need to look. She hesitated, then muttered that access to financial disclosures required higher authorization. I felt a small, familiar impatience, the kind that arrives when people say we can't out of habit. I stepped away, pulled out my phone, and typed a single secure message to Anya. Authorize Sabrina Cho, Aurelius Grand, full audit access. I hit send. For a moment I could see skepticism in Sabrina's face, and then her computer device chimed. Her access had been elevated. The relief on her face was immediate and real. She smiled, a tired, grateful expression I hadn't seen in the boardrooms. I didn't think you'd actually do that, she said softly. I shrugged. I don't like leaving a problem to fester. With access, we dug deeper. The supplier's owner was listed on filings I pulled up, a small, family-run company registered in Nevada. The ownership papers, however, had a loop in them. The vendor was nominally owned by a man named Daniel Price, but there were shell companies tied to his name that funneled money back to different accounts. The kicker was a pattern in Mark's bank records if the bank details were to be believed. There were regular transfers to an account that, on paper, belonged to his brother-in-law. It was the classic setup. Overcharge a client, approve an inflated invoice, shift the surplus through a friendly company, and everyone silently pockets a piece. The money trail read like the same scam I'd read about in business case studies, but this was real money and real people. Sabrina's face went slack as the numbers added up. $2,400,000 in 18 months, she whispered. The words felt heavy in the room. She was furious but exhausted. I've had a feeling, she said, but Mark is popular. People stay loyal to him. He's been here forever. I watched her wrestle with the cost of action versus inaction. There were lawsuits, criminal charges, messy headlines. There were also months of shortfalls, staff cuts, and the slow erosion of trust if nothing was done. I thought of Grandpa's advice: handle things quietly, fix what's broken, and keep the story from becoming a show. He liked tidy solutions that didn't ruin people unnecessarily. I also thought about the employees of Rhodes Shipping and the workers here who'd been losing money because of petty corruption. I wanted the money back, the system clean, and the integrity intact. We decided on a quiet approach. Public humiliation would create headlines that could hurt the brand and the employees whose jobs depended on stable revenue. I arranged a meeting for the next morning. I told Sabrina we'd bring in the in-house counsel and a senior operations manager. She looked relieved and scared. I told her to keep it tight, no notes to staff, no leaks. She nodded. If this leaks, it'll ruin a lot of people's trust in me, she said. I'm not ready for that. I placed a hand on the table, steady. Then we'll make sure it doesn't. We'll make it clean and final. The meeting room the next day felt colder. Mark sat across from me, rubbing his hands together until the skin on his knuckles looked pale. He'd been called in under the pretense of a standard contract review, which made his face flush like a man caught off guard. The lawyer started by laying out the evidence: invoice copies, ownership documents, bank transfers, signatures. I watched Mark's face as I spoke. He tried the old bluff at first, a puff of bravado that thinly covered his fear. He started to talk about long relationships and trusted vendors, the same tired defenses that sound convincing only if people want to believe them. I didn't yell, I didn't make a scene. I put the papers on the table and slid them across to him. Mark, I said in the calmest voice I could find, what you did was wrong, but making a spectacle helps no one. There are two ways this goes. I watched his jaw work. You resign, you sign a confession of wrongdoing and an agreement to repay the $2.4 million. We'll keep this out of the press and we'll help with a plan that allows you to make restitution without destroying your life. Or we go public and we involve the authorities. That will end you financially and likely bring criminal charges. The room felt very small for a moment, sweat beaded on his upper lip. He tried to bargain. He promised to pay it back slowly and blamed a gambling problem and poor decisions. The lawyer cut him off with a paper and a pen. This is your chance to make the best of a bad situation, she said. Resign, sign here, and we close the chapter. He stared at the documents like they were a mirror showing him a face he didn't recognize. After a long minute, he scribbled his name, his hand trembling. He put the pen down like someone who'd just performed a painful surgery on himself. Then he asked hoarsely, "Will you prosecute?" I shook my head. "No, you cooperate, you repay what you owe, and you keep the next step as private as possible. We get the money back, you get a chance to fix your life, but you leave now," he signed. The confession felt like a rope finally cut. He stood up, hugged nothing, and walked out carrying a box of the few personal items he had in a corporate office. I watched him go. The deputy procurement manager, a woman named Layla who'd been quietly excellent but overlooked for years, sat with her hands clenched. I offered her the position Mark had vacated. Her face flooded with relief and something like joy. "Of course," she whispered, voice thick, "I won't let you down." I extended a modest bonus for Sabrina, for catching it and for your courage, I told her. She blinked and tried to protest, but I insisted. By that afternoon, the supplier contract had been terminated, the company put on alert for audits, and initial steps were taken to recover funds. Mark's repayment plan was aggressive but realistic. He was going to liquidate a small rental property and set up monthly transfers. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wouldn't fix everything he'd done. But it avoided a scandal that could hammer the casino's reputation and throw jobs into limbo. Sabrina stood in the doorway as I left the building later, sunlight making the glass sparkle. She looked younger than she'd appeared the day before. "Thank you," she said simply. "You handled that the way it needed to be handled." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The fix had been clinical, precise, and humane where possible. It bought loyalty, Sabrina's, Layla's, and a quiet respect among staff who saw a problem resolved without a circus. It bought the company $2,400,000 back into the bottom line and stopped a leak that, left unchecked, would have opened into something much worse. As I walked out into the Las Vegas heat, the neon beginning to glow in the falling light, I realized this was what Grandpa had meant by using wealth as a tool. The money was not a hammer I used to smash people. It was a lever I could use to lift things that mattered: jobs, reputations, futures. For the first time since Monaco, I felt a clean kind of confidence. I wasn't just playing a game of revenge. I was running something, and I was getting better at it. I flew back to Portland with a new sense of calm, but I knew I couldn't keep living out of hotels or my old apartment. I needed a base, a place that didn't whisper my past at every corner. My real estate agent, Lena, called it a statement and showed me the usual suspects. Stuffy old money mansions with heavy curtains and tax histories long enough to bore a committee. They felt like stage sets of my family's life, all inherited taste and no backbone. Then she drove me up a hill and pulled into a narrow drive. The house was glass and cedar and honest lines, perched like a ship captain's lookout over the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a tree that looked like it had been planted to frame the sunset, an entryway that gave you the sense the outside belonged with the inside. It wasn't fussy, it didn't shout, it simply existed, beautiful and unobliging. The walk-through smelled faintly of new wood and lemon oil, the floors warm under my shoes. The price tag was absurd for me in my old life. $17,400,000. I clicked buy in my head before the agent could finish her pitch. I bought it through a trust, exactly the kind of quiet distance my grandfather had valued. The paperwork was anonymous to the public, but the sale still hit the headlines. The society blogger in town loves a mystery, and she wrote about a mystery buyer snapping up one of the city's most talked about houses. The article had the kind of breathless tone you save for movie stars. Mom sent me the link with a string of exclamation points. "Can you believe someone has this kind of money? It's just obscene," she wrote. I replied simply, "It's a beautiful house." I didn't want to gloat, I wanted the place to speak before I did. A week later, after the last painting was hung and the carpets rolled out, I sent invitations. I wanted them there. It was the perfect stage, my new home, my rules, my controls. The envelope said nothing more than, "Please join me at my home this Saturday." I knew how they would read it. They always read things as challenges or opportunities. The phone calls started within minutes. Mom called first, voice a mix of curiosity and anxiety. "Emily, what is this? This is a joke, right? You can't afford that house." I kept my answer gentle. "I've had a change in circumstances. Please, just come, I want to celebrate with you." Derek texted a string of question marks, then called to ask if I'd won the lottery. Kendra sent a heart and a wine emoji and asked what to bring. They were all curious in the way people are about other people's money, sharp, eager, and a little hungry. They arrived together like a small, tense pack. They walked through my front door with that proprietary air of people who assume any new thing in the family world belongs to them to examine and claim. Mom's heels clicked on my hardwood as she moved from room to room, touching a cushion, raising an eyebrow at the art. Derek's phone nervously illuminated his palm as he checked messages even as he pretended not to. Kendra drifted from window to window as if measuring the view for how she'd show it off on vacation. Dad stood by the large living room window looking down at the city lights, the distant shimmer of the docks a familiar, private geography to him. He lingered there longer than anyone else, like a man trying to locate the pieces of his life on a new map. I offered champagne. I watched them take their first sips, their faces open and tasting, eyes quick to catalog details. I let them admire the view and the glass and the way the city looked small and tractable below us. There was a private thrill in seeing their curiosity replace their casual contempt. I wanted them to feel how small their old assumptions looked in this light. After a few minutes of small talk, whether the new wine opener Derek wanted to buy, Mom's imagined renovation plans for her Napa house, Dad turned and looked at me, the kind of look that had always tried to measure me against some invisible standard. "All right, Emily," he said, half amusement and half suspicion. "What is this? What's going on?" I set my glass down with the calmness I'd practiced through every silent dinner and awkward holiday visit. The room sounded huge for a second, the air amplifying the small click of ice in a glass. "Grandpa didn't just leave me an envelope," I said. "He left me everything." I let the words out slow, letting them roll around the place before they landed. I watched their faces like a student watches a chemical reaction. I told them what I had learned in Monaco. I didn't read them the precise numbers. I had no interest in turning the moment into a math quiz, but I let them understand the scale. 2 casinos, major properties in several cities, steady income far beyond anything they'd seen on family ledgers. I told them my grandfather had wanted me to grow up grounded. I told them he had believed I should find my own path without being swallowed by the rest of their hunger. I watched expressions change from confusion to a softer kind of shock. They moved through disbelief like people sinking into a cold pool. Mom was the first to speak, and the accusation in her voice came like a blade. "So, you bought this house with his money?" she asked, the words blunt and accusing, as if she could unmake the purchase by claiming moral high ground. "Yes," I said, "and I bought other things too." I watched her face shift into calculation, trying to find a place where she could be offended enough to keep her dignity. I told them about Rhodes shipping. I watched Derek's jaw set as he realized this wasn't just a pretty house. I told them the company had a new owner called Blue Meridian Holdings. I let the silence settle, and then I said the part I had been waiting to say. "Blue Meridian Holdings is mine." The room's air seemed to change like a wind through a closed window. They looked as if someone had dumped a bucket of cold water over them. Shock was the first shape on their faces, disbelief, a quick recalculation of how their lives might shift. Then confusion. Dad's eyes were going very fast, scanning my face for some trick or loophole for a bank statement he could refute. Derek made a noise that might have been laughter, but it was too sharp to be amused. Kendra covered her mouth with one hand and then began to cry, the sound small but sharp, as if she'd been startled. Mom's voice found a different edge. "You bought my husband's company?" she asked, though of course that wasn't accurate. Her tone wasn't about facts, it was about betrayal. "How could you, after everything we've done for you?" "This is a betrayal." Her words came out as if rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for a chance to sound wounded in public. The look in her eyes was the old one, not pity, but a deep, entitled outrage that we were all taught to respect. Derek's reaction was louder and meaner. He dropped his champagne flute, letting it shatter on the stone floor. Glass petals skittered, and for a horrible second the noise felt like a punctuation mark to everything we'd been through. "You tricked him," he shouted at Dad, then turned his anger on me. "You think you're so smart, you're just a little girl playing with a checkbook you didn't earn." He tried to make me small the way they'd always done, by reminding me of my old life. Dad's face went a weird, mottled red. You tricked me," he said, not sure if that was accusation or confession. He reached for something to steady himself, the mantle, a chair. Rage and embarrassment warred in his expression. Mom's voice got sharp and cold. "We'll see you in court," she said, or at least intended it for court. The threats started like a chorus: suits, contests of the will, lawyers. It was the old pattern. Escalate, frighten, hope the other person folds. Kendra's tears kept falling. "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you," she said between sobs, as if she held the right to speak for him now that he was gone. I felt a quiet, bitter twist at that. Grandpa had left me to choose not to please them. Then Dad leaned in, his voice dangerously quiet. "We'll go to the press," he whispered. "We'll tell everyone how you swindled your own family. We'll make you look unstable, they'll eat that up." He thought he had a threat that would fracture my credibility and force me to back down. He thought public opinion was a weapon he could use to shame me into surrender. For a moment I saw in his eyes the old man who wanted the applause of his peers more than the truth. The room smelled suddenly like expensive perfume and old anger. They left in a small, chaotic oblong, voices overlapping, threats trailing like exhaust. The door closed behind them, and the house that had felt alive minutes before went quiet as a held breath. I stood in the emptiness of the living room, glass in tiny glittering piles at my feet, and felt the truth settle inside me. They'd seen me, and they didn't like the size I took up, but they had no idea what I intended to do with what my grandfather had given me. After they left, the house felt suddenly too big and too quiet, as if they'd taken the air with them. The glass and cedar that had felt bold and clean a few hours earlier now felt like a stage, and I was the actor left on it while the audience stormed out. Their voices kept replaying in my head: betrayal, swindled, ashamed, little knives disguised as moral outrage. For the first night, I wandered from room to room, touching the surfaces because it made me feel less unreal. The wood under my fingers was warm. The city lights spread below like a map I could study, but all I heard were their words. I sat down at the kitchen island and let myself feel the ache they'd wanted me to feel. For a long time, I just let it wash over me, the old, small girl belief they'd nurtured for years that I wasn't enough. Not clever enough, not bold enough, not worthy of what I'd been given. That voice had been their tool for so long. Mom had used it to keep me quiet. Dad had used it to feel superior. Their cruelty had been folded into everyday life so neatly I hadn't always seen the stitches. Standing here now, surrounded by the results of decisions I had made without them, I felt the old wound open. It hurt like the first time someone told you you didn't belong. Then I thought of Grandpa and his stubborn, steady words. He'd handed me the compass years before, heavy and cool in my palm. "It always points true north, Emily," he'd said. He'd left me more than money, he'd left me an idea of what to do with it. The truth was, their anger stung, but it didn't change the fact that 214 people depended on me to act. My doubt was a small, private thing. The leak of their contempt didn't alter the math or the people who drove those ships. I cleaned up the broken glass, bagged it, and carried it to the trash, the sound of it muffled and ordinary. Small practical acts steadied me in a way words never had. That night I didn't try to sleep. I opened Grandpa's journal and read until the edges of the pages blurred. He'd written about steady work, about fairness, about how money could be used to build things that lasted. I held the compass and felt its cool face against my palm as if it were a tiny, stubborn heartbeat. The old fear that I might become like them, that I might use this as a hammer, rose up, then receded. I made a list, quiet and precise: protect the workers, fix the company, make real changes no one could pretend were accidental. The hurt was still there, but it felt like fuel now, not a leash. I found my north. It started small online. Kendra posted something about family loyalty with a glossy photo of her and Grandpa, words about remembering roots and honoring legacy. It was a gentle stab dressed up as sentiment. Then a friend of theirs dropped a hint to a local society blog. The mystery buyer had been revealed. The blogger ate it up. Within hours, there were whispers in comment sections and barroom corners, half-truths that would look ugly in headlines. My phone buzzed with texts and DMs from people I vaguely remembered, old classmates, ex-colleagues, people who showed up at funerals to look important. They were all hungry for a version of me they could explain away, the poor, odd teacher who had been given too much and would surely lose her mind. The pattern was familiar: inflame first, then wait for me to flinch. Mom called, voice tight with outrage. She presented as moral concern. "Emily, people are saying things," she said. "Are you sure you want this?" Her choice of words was meant to make me doubt. Dad's friends started asking questions, the kind of questions that would end up in a weekend column. I handed the cacophony to Anya. She routed everything official, reporters, lawyers, through her office. We kept a calm, private front, but the smear campaign did what these things always do. It tried to turn the town into a jury. I refused to play that game. Sitting at my desk under the warm lamp, I looked through the lists I'd made. The noise outside the house was just noise. The real work was inside the company and the lives it supported. My allies were real people, Anya with her steel, Sabrina with her quiet competence, the dock foreman who remembered Grandpa and still shook my hand like I was carrying on something important. I knew my family better than they knew me. I knew Dad's need to look like a winner, Mom's hunger for appearances, Derek's instinct to lash out. Those things would become choices I could use, not weapons they could hide behind. My plan had to be public in some parts and private in others. It had to be unshowy where it mattered and visible where it sent a message. After 2 days of letting the gossip swell, I had Anya send them formal letters. I didn't want theatrics. I wanted decision. The letter said nothing inflammatory. It invited them to a private meeting at my house and made clear that it was essential we resolve the family and business matters without going to court or the press. That last line was measured. It pointed out the obvious without snarling. I also added a small note through Anya that failure to attend would force Northlight management to take swift public steps to protect its assets and reputation. It wasn't a threat in bluster, it was a fact. They could either choose privacy and a solution, or they could make the dispute public and watch what the truth did under bright lights. They arrived one at a time, not as a united front this time. Their shoulders were tight, their faces drained. They looked like people who'd been waiting for others to act and now had to take responsibility for their own fury. I didn't meet them at the door. I had them shown into the long living area I'd arranged like a conference room, the dining table cleared and set with simple water glasses. The room felt different at that moment, less a home and more a place to settle an account. I sat at the end of the table, my compass beside me where they could see it. When they took their seats across from me, the air was taut with the kinds of unsaid things families say to themselves when they try to pretend everything is normal. I started right away. "Let's be clear about what's going to happen," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Years of being ignored had taught me how to speak so people had to listen. "You are going to stop talking to the press. You are going to stop harassing me and our employees. The war you think you're starting is over." Dad began to protest, the reflexive protest of a man who'd always been used to getting the last word. I raised a hand to cut him off. "You will listen," I said. The compass was there beside my notebook, its brass face catching the light, a tiny emblem of the decision I'd already made. I laid out 2 options, simple and precise. Option 1. They keep up the campaign of leaks and whispers. If they chose that path, I would respond. I'd release the full financial records of Rhodes Shipping from the last 5 years, showing the loans and the risky bets and the way those choices had put jobs at risk. I'd also publish the letter my grandfather had written to me from Monaco, the one where Mom suggested keeping me small. I described it plainly and without malice. The public would read the truth about why I was in this position and how the family had behaved. The idea of their private quarrels airing in the paper with exact numbers and names attached made Mom's face go white. Then I softened my tone a fraction and described option 2. It was the easy path for them if they wanted to keep dignity and avoid a spectacle. They would issue a full public apology to me, posted on the same platforms and in the same places they'd been using to spread rumors. They would promise to stop contact unless I initiated it and sign a private agreement to that effect. No grand admissions of guilt in cathedrals of shame, just a short, honest correction and a commitment to stop. They would acknowledge that the rumors were wrong, that I had every right to my role, and they would accept the new order quietly. Dad looked at me then in a way I hadn't seen before. Not as the dutiful daughter or the scapegoat, but as someone who'd made a choice and had the power to back it up. "And what about my place?" he asked, voice small and sudden. The question was about more than a title, it was about pride. I put down my pen and reached for the compass. "You can keep your title," I said. "You can keep your office and your salary, but you'll report to Northlight Management. The company runs under new leadership, and that means I get the final say on strategy. You stay, but you don't run things anymore." The room held its breath. The line between mercy and control was a thin one, but it was deliberate. I wasn't out to humiliate them for fun. I wanted stability, and I wanted them to understand the realignment. They stared at the papers on the table, the same plain forms Anya had prepared. The offer on the table was simple. An apology, a signed agreement to stop the harassment, and the quiet acceptance of a new chain of command. It was a chance to step away with dignity. It was also a clear line. Cross it, and the alternative would make all the details public. I watched each face as the weight of the choice landed. This was the moment I had prepared for, the junction between chaos and order. I was ready. They stared at the paper on the table like it might explode. Anya had drafted the apology in language that left no room for spin. A short statement admitting error, withdrawing the rumors, and expressing support for my role and the company's future. It was the same platform they'd used to parade their inheritances: social media, the society blog, the little community pages that had eaten up every whisper. They hated it. They hated that they had to use the same channels they'd weaponized. They hated that they had to say the words, "You're asking us to humiliate ourselves," Derek snapped at first, the old boy's swagger crumpling into teenage petulance. Kendra dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, a practiced, shaky hand. Mom's mouth tightened into a line like a seam pulled too tight. Dad looked like he wanted to argue and then realized there was nothing useful to argue with. They'd come with threats and bluster, but this was not what they'd planned. The choice now was public dignity or public exposure. I kept my voice soft. "Posted exactly as written," I said. "No edits, no commentary." By 5 p.m. today, Anya had left an electronic window open on my tablet where the drafts were waiting. Each of them scrolled with fingers that trembled a little. They read, adjusted their faces to whatever expression made sense for the camera, and then one by one started posting. Dad's post was short, embarrassed, and oddly honest. A retraction, a line about family failures, and a statement of support. Mom's read like a press release, cautious and lawyer-approved, but it said the thing: she was sorry for the harm, she supported my work with the company, she asked for privacy. Derek's post was the last and the most awkward. He tried to be witty, then settled for a clean apology and a promise to stop feeding the gossip. Kendra posted pictures of Grandpa with a few kind words and then the apology, followed by a sudden flurry of hearts from followers who didn't know the truth, only the image she wanted to project. Within an hour, the society blogger updated the original piece with a correction and a short note: the family's statements. The gossip threads quieted. The town still buzzed, but the narrative had shifted back to the facts. They'd chosen privacy and apology over public war. They'd let the record wipe the stains instead of letting the stains define the story. The relief that passed through the room was visible, but so was the strain. They'd lost something more than control. They'd lost the shape of what they'd thought the relationship was. After they posted, I slid the other sheet of paper across the table. The agreement Anya had drafted that asked them to stop contacting me unless I initiated it, and to stop making public statements about family matters. It was polite, short, unembellished. "Sign this," I said. "It's not about punishment, it's about boundaries." Mom's fingers hovered, then she took the pen and signed. Dad's hand shook a little when he wrote his name. Derek scrawled like a man signing out of obligation. Kendra signed last, reservoir of tears drying into a hard line. One by one they sealed it. That should have been the end of it, but I knew the work wasn't over. Power rearranges things, and you have to make sure the pieces fit the way you want. So I moved to the other part of the plan, the new order of the company. Dad finally asked it in a voice that sounded smaller than I'd ever heard. And my place? He wasn't asking for a title, he was asking for the dignity to stand in front of his peers without being laughed at. What happens to me? I set the brass compass down on the table and let it catch the light. You can stay, I said. You can keep the title of general manager, you can keep your office and your salary, you can even keep your name on the ships for now, but you answer to Northlight management. That means you take direction from the board I put together, you lead under oversight, and you do it with transparency. You don't make unilateral, risky decisions anymore. You become part of a team that looks out for the people who actually make this company run. He stared at the compass like it was some strange relic. So I'm not in charge? His pride flared like an old bruise. No, I said. You're part of the company, you're valued, but the ultimate responsibility rests with Northlight management. We will measure outcomes, protect jobs, invest in the fleet, and align the company's work with values Grandpa believed in. You'll have a voice, you'll have respect, but you'll follow a plan that keeps the company alive and the people employed. Silence sat heavy. It wasn't a humiliation, not really. It was a reshuffling of responsibility. He could keep his dignity if he accepted help. He could keep his paycheck if he accepted the truth about what the company needed. He could remain part of the story instead of becoming a cautionary tale. Anya had the new board documents ready. They were simple: roles, lines of reporting, a clause about oversight and employee protections, and a schedule for public reporting so the company couldn't hide behind spin. Dad read everything slowly, as if each sentence were a brick he had to step on. When he finally signed, his pen left a dark, deliberate line. The compass was in my hand again. I tapped its cool metal. Grandpa taught me to find north, I said. This is our north. They all signed the final papers, one after the other, the pen strokes like small concessions that added up to something bigger than any single person. The fight had a winner and a set of rules, and the winner chose mercy over vengeance. I wasn't interested in destroying them. I was interested in building and in keeping the promises that had been made to the workers and to my grandfather. The next week, apologies appeared online at exactly 4:55 p.m., the timestamp as clean and deliberate as the rest of what we'd done. The blogger posted a retraction and an update to the story. The smear campaign sputtered out, starved of oxygen. The town had its gossip for a day and then moved on. For me, the return to normalcy wasn't quiet, it was intentional and busy. I walked into Rhodes Shipping's office the following Monday like someone in a uniform, but my uniform was a simple coat and the files I'd read so many times. I walked past Dad's office. He was there, behind the same desk where he'd acted like a king, speaking into a phone. He looked smaller in a way that wasn't shameful, just recalibrated. I met with the senior management team, the people who had actually kept the ships moving while titles and speeches circulated. They were pragmatic, sharp, and weary of promises. I laid out the plan: sustainability, a path to healthier cash flow, investments in cleaner engines, and a profit-sharing program for the employees. I spoke plainly about timelines and outcomes. They asked smart questions. They pushed back when something seemed wishful. We built a list of immediate priorities and a calendar for the next 12 months. Outside the office, my family retreated into their new lives. Derek went quiet online, the kind of silence that looks like embarrassment. Mom buried herself in the vineyard, oversaw contractors, and busied herself with projects that kept her hands full. Kendra took a long trip on her yacht, posting photos of sun and distant coastlines. They still had their things: houses, cars, the trappings they'd celebrated, but the real control had shifted. They could still be part of our lives on my terms, or they could be part of a past I had neatly closed. That silence from them was the kind of peace I hadn't known I wanted. It was more powerful than their apologies. 6 months later, the first of the new hybrid ships pulled into the dock under the Rhodes flag. We held a ceremony at sunrise. The air had that oily, salty sharpness that always smells like home to me. I invited all 214 employees and their families. They lined the pier with smiling faces, children clutching balloons, older men with weathered caps gripping their spouses' hands. I spoke from a small podium under a makeshift banner that read Roads Shipping, a new course. Dad stood behind me, clapping, his expression a mixture of proud and unsettled, like someone watching a child take the first steps he had once imagined for himself. I announced the profit-sharing plan. I explained how the cleaner engines would lower costs and emissions and how that money would go back to the people who made the company run. I introduced the Graham Whitaker Foundation, seeded with $100 million to fund science and technology programs in underfunded public schools. I told them Grandpa's story, the long version, about work, risk, and the belief that building people mattered more than building towers. My voice cracked once, and someone in the crowd laughed kindly, like an old friend reminding me to breathe. After the ceremony, people came up to shake my hand, to ask about schedules, to offer thank yous that sounded like they meant something more than gratitude. The dock foreman, a broad man named Louis who'd known Grandpa, gripped my hand so hard his knuckles left a print. "You did good," he said, and that was the closest thing to a blessing I could have asked for. Standing at the edge of the pier, I looked back at the city and then up at my house on the hill, its glass catching the sun. The compass in my pocket felt light. I remembered the will reading, the white envelope, the sting of Mom's words. I had been small once, shaped into a role to serve someone's comfort. Now I had a company that ran on the values Grandpa had taught me, a foundation that would help kids like the ones in my classroom, and a family kept at a distance that made sense. My revenge wasn't a scream. It was a long, quiet series of decisions that built something instead of breaking them. It was letting Dad come to the stage and clap, but making sure he clapped for the right reasons. It was 1,000 small, deliberate acts that turned humiliation into habit and habit into legacy. I hadn't wanted to hurt them. I'd wanted to make a life that mattered. That's my story of how I took back my power. Have you ever had to prove someone wrong who underestimated you? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories to come.